2-year-old child was found dead in his stroller. 5 more people were found murdered on a lonely German farm. 4 bodies were hidden under hay in the barn, and the new maid, who had arrived only hours earlier, was killed in her room. But the most disturbing part was this. After killing everyone, the murderer did not run away. Someone stayed inside the farm. The animals were fed. The fireplace was used. Food was eaten. And for days, no one knew the family was already dead. This was Hinterkaifeck, one of the darkest unsolved murders in history, and the nightmare began before the killings. Footprints in the snow led toward the farm, but none led back. Hinterkaifeck was not a place people visited by accident. It stood alone in the countryside of Bavaria, Germany. The nearest village, Grobern, was around half a kilometer away. That may not sound far today, but in 1922, surrounded by fields, forest, darkness, and snow, that distance mattered. If something happened at Hinterkaifeck, no one would hear it. The farm was home to the Gruber family. Andreas Gruber was the head of the household. He lived there with his wife, Cecilia. Their daughter, Victoria, also lived on the farm. Victoria had been married to a man named Karl Gabriel, but Karl had died during World War I. She had a young daughter named Cecilia Gabriel. There was also a little boy named Joseph. And on March 31, 1922, a new maid named Maria Baumgartner arrived at the farm for her first day of work. It would also be her last. The Gruber family was known by people nearby, but they were not exactly loved. Neighbors described them as strange, hardworking but closed off, quiet, private, difficult to understand. They lived mostly to themselves, and that isolation would become one of the reasons the case became so terrifying. Because when the nightmare came to Hinterkaifeck, there was no one close enough to stop it. Before the murders, strange things were already happening, and this is where the story becomes deeply unsettling. On the morning of March 30, 1922, Andreas Gruber walked outside and noticed footprints in the snow. They led from the forest toward the farm, toward the engine hut. But there was one problem. There were no footprints leading back. Someone had walked onto the property. Someone had approached the farm. But somehow that person had not left the same way. Andreas checked the engine hut and found that the door had been forced open. Someone had been inside, but nothing was stolen. No tools were missing. No valuable items were gone. It looked less like a robbery and more like someone had been studying the farm, trying to understand its layout, trying to find a way inside. Now think about this. You live on a lonely farm. You find fresh tracks in the snow. They lead to your property, but they never leave. Would you sleep peacefully that night? Or would you look at every shadow and wonder whether someone was still hiding nearby? The footprints were only the beginning. Around the same time, the family found a strange magazine from Munich lying on the property. No one in the house had ordered it. No one nearby had subscribed to it. Even the mailman said it was not part of his deliveries. So where did it come from? Was it dropped accidentally? Was it left by a stranger? Or was it another sign that someone had been close to the house? The family did not know. But soon, the fear moved from outside the farm to inside the walls. In the days before the massacre, Victoria and the family's maid began hearing strange noises from the attic. Footsteps, movement, sounds that should not have been there. Andreas searched the attic, but found nothing. No stranger, no animal, no explanation. But the maid, Crescens Rieger, was terrified. She later said that around midnight, her bedroom door would open by itself. Even when it was locked, she never saw anyone. But it kept happening, almost every night, at the same hour. Eventually, she became so frightened that she quit her job and left Hinterkaifeck. That decision saved her life, because after she left, the Grubers hired a new maid, Maria Baumgartner. Maria arrived at Hinterkaifeck on March 31, 1922. Her sister brought her to the farm and then left. Before leaving, the sister noticed something. Nothing dramatic, no screaming, no blood, no visible danger, just a feeling. The farm felt incredibly lonely. Those may have been the last words ever spoken by someone who saw the family alive. Because within hours, Hinterkaifeck would become a graveyard. What happened on the night of March 31st is still not fully known. No survivor was left to tell the story. No confession was ever made. No killer was ever caught. But investigators later created a theory from the evidence. They believed the killer entered through the machine area and reached the barn. The Gruber family was probably inside the living quarters, preparing for the night. Then, somehow, the killer lured them into the barn one by one. First Andreas, then Victoria, then the older Cecilia, then young Cecilia Gabriel. One by one, they walked into the dark barn. One by one, they were attacked. But this raises one of the most disturbing questions in the entire case. How do you lure 4 people into a barn one at a time, without the others realizing something is wrong? If the first person was killed, why did the second follow? If the second disappeared, why did the third go? What did the killer say? What sound did they use? Did the family trust the killer? Or did the killer know them personally? That question still has no answer. The victims were beaten with a heavy farm tool. The blows were focused mainly on the head. The violence was brutal, personal, overwhelming. Inside the house, the little boy Joseph was killed in his stroller. Andrew Maria, the new maid who had arrived only hours earlier, was killed in her room. 6 people, an entire household, gone in one night. But the killer did not run away. And that is what makes Hinterkaifeck feel different from most murder cases. Because after the killings, someone stayed. For days after the massacre, people near Hinterkaifeck did not realize the family was dead. At first, small things seemed strange. 7-year-old Cecilia did not show up at school, but she had missed school before, so no one panicked immediately. Then the family missed church. Vendors came to the farm and got no answer. The postman found silence. A hunting party passed by and noticed no smoke from the chimney. Neighbors began to feel that something was wrong, but still, no one knew the truth. The most disturbing detail is that the farm seemed active. The animals were still alive. The cows were heard crying in the barn. There were signs that someone had been feeding them. The fireplace had been used. Food appeared to have been eaten. This means that after murdering 6 people, the killer may have remained at Hinterkaifeck for hours, maybe days, walking through the same rooms, eating in the same house, feeding the same animals, standing above the bodies they had hidden. Imagine that. The family was dead, but the farm kept moving, as if someone was pretending nothing had happened, as if the killer had taken the family's place. A few days after the murders, a repairman named Albert Hoffner arrived at the farm. He had been hired weeks earlier to repair the farm engine. When he reached Hinterkaifeck, he found the place silent. The doors were locked. He looked through the kitchen window but saw no one. He heard the cows making noise. But because the Gruber family was known to be odd and private, he did not immediately assume murder. So he waited. He whistled. He tried to make his presence known. Still, no one came. Eventually, he went to the engine house and began working. He stayed there for hours. The entire time, 6 bodies were hidden nearby. Think about that for a second. A man worked alone on that farm for more than 4 hours, not knowing he was surrounded by murder victims, not knowing whether the killer had already left, or whether the killer was still somewhere inside the house watching him. After finishing the repair, Albert left, but he told others that something was strange. The farm seemed empty. The family was nowhere to be found. That finally pushed the neighbors to investigate. And the first person who decided to search seriously was a man whose name would become one of the most controversial in the entire case. Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Lorenz Schlittenbauer was a neighbor of the Gruber family. He also had a complicated connection to Victoria. There were claims that he may have been the father of little Joseph, but the family situation was full of rumors, accusations, and tension. When Lorenz heard that no one had been seen at the farm, he became suspicious. First, he sent his sons to check. They returned saying they saw no one, only the sound of cattle screaming in the barn. So Lorenz went himself, along with 2 neighbors, Michael Paul and Jakob Sigel. When they arrived, most of the doors were locked. They eventually forced their way into the barn. At first, nothing looked obvious. Then Michael saw something sticking out from under a pile of hay. A foot. He pulled it, and realized it belonged to Andreas Gruber. Then they saw more bodies. Hidden under the hay were Andreas, Victoria, Cecilia Gruber, and young Cecilia Gabriel. 4 bodies in the barn. Then they entered the living area. Inside, they found little Joseph dead in his stroller. His head had been crushed. In another room, they found Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, dead under a blanket. She had been on the farm only a few hours before she was murdered. The lonely farm had become a slaughterhouse, and the killer had vanished. When investigators examined the bodies, they discovered that most victims had suffered heavy blows to the head. Their skulls had been cracked or shattered. The weapon was eventually believed to be a farm tool, possibly a mattock or hoe. But one victim's injuries stood out: young Cecilia Gabriel. She had not died immediately. Investigators believed she may have survived for hours after the attack. Her body showed signs that she had scratched at her own throat. Tufts of hair were found in her hands, most likely her own hair, pulled out while she was dying. That detail is almost unbearable. Because it means that after the killer left her under the hay, the child may have still been alive, in pain, terrified, lying among the bodies of her own family, waiting in the dark. This is where Hinterkaifeck stops feeling like a mystery and becomes something much more horrifying. Because whoever did this was not just trying to kill, they left a child to suffer. The police believed the killer understood the layout of Hinterkaifeck. This was not a simple attack by a random stranger passing through. The killer knew where to enter. They knew how to move through the farm. They knew how to use the barn. They knew how to hide the bodies, and they may have known the family well enough to lure them one by one. This is why investigators began looking at people connected to the Grubers. The first major suspect was Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the same neighbor who helped discover the bodies. Suspicion grew because of his behavior at the crime scene. After finding the bodies in the barn, Lorenz entered the house and unlocked the front door using a key. But how did he have access? Some people believed the Gruber family may have given him a key because he was a neighbor. Others believed Victoria may have given it to him privately. But there was another disturbing detail. Before the murders, Andreas Gruber had reportedly lost a key to the house. So when Lorenz used a key at the crime scene, people wondered, was it his key? Was it Victoria's? Or was it the missing key? Lorenz also moved some of the bodies, disturbing the crime scene. He later said he was searching for his son, Josef. But some people believed he knew too much. Too many details, too much about the farm, too much about what had happened. Still, suspicion is not proof. Andrew Lorenz was never convicted. Lorenz was not the only name connected to the case. Another suspect was Anton Bickler. He had once been interested in the former maid, Kristen's Rieger. According to her statement, Anton had proposed to her, but the Gruber family warned her against him. They accused him of stealing. They believed he was not trustworthy. Kristen's later said that after she rejected Anton, she heard he blamed the Gruber family for keeping them apart. He allegedly said that the people at Hinterkaifeck should all be killed. That is a chilling thing to say before a massacre. Anton also knew the farm. He had helped with harvest work before, and the family dog, which usually barked at strangers, reportedly did not bark at him. That detail mattered. Because if the killer was someone the dog knew, it might explain why no one was alerted. Kristen's also mentioned another man, Georg Siegel, who she believed may have been involved, but again, there was no strong evidence. Only statements, rumors, suspicion, and an old case slowly losing its trail. There was even a strange theory that Victoria's dead husband, Carl Gabriel, had not really died in World War I. According to the theory, he returned secretly, found his wife with another child, and killed the family in rage. But authorities investigated his death and found no reason to believe he was alive. That theory sounds dramatic, but most likely it was only speculation. And speculation is exactly what this case is filled with, because the killer left almost nothing behind. Hinterkaifeck is not famous only because 6 people were murdered. It is famous because of the unanswered questions. Who made the footprints in the snow? Why were there no tracks leading away? Who left the strange magazine? Who was moving in the attic? Why did the maid's locked door open at midnight? How did the killer lure the family into the barn one by one? Why did they stay after the murders? Why feed the animals? Why use the fireplace? Why hide the bodies but not flee immediately? And most importantly, who had enough hatred to kill an entire family, including children and a maid who had just arrived? The case feels less like a normal murder investigation and more like a nightmare with missing pieces. Every clue raises another question. Every suspect leads to another dead end. Every theory explains one detail but fails to explain another. That is why Hinterkaifeck refuses to disappear. It is not just a murder case. It is a locked door that no one has ever opened. A farm in the snow. A family that heard footsteps in the attic. A killer who may have watched them for days. And a crime scene that still feels alive more than a century later. More than 100 years have passed since the Hinterkaifeck massacre. The farm itself is gone now. The family is gone. The witnesses are gone. The suspects are gone. But the questions remain. Someone walked through the snow toward that lonely farm. Someone may have hidden inside or near the property. Someone killed 6 people with brutal force. Someone stayed afterward. And then that person disappeared into history. No confession. No conviction. No final answer. Maybe the killer was a neighbor. Maybe it was someone the family trusted. Maybe it was someone whose name was never even recorded. But one thing is certain. On that cold night in 1922, Hinterkaifeck became one of the darkest mysteries in true crime history. Because some murders are solved by evidence, some are solved by confession, And some are buried so deep in silence that even after 100 years, the dead are still waiting for someone to name their killer.